Picture this. You're bleeding in a French forest, fighting for a country that has your mother locked behind barbed wire in a desert prison camp. She's labeled an enemy alien. You're wearing the American uniform. This actually happened, and over 33,000 men volunteered for it. Before December 7, 1941, Japanese Americans had spent decades building lives in the United States that looked remarkably ordinary. Starting in 1885, Japanese immigrants arrived on American shores seeking opportunity, working in agriculture, fishing, and small businesses along the West Coast. They faced discrimination from the beginning, but they persisted. By the 1920s, immigration laws had essentially barred further Japanese immigration, but those already here had established roots. Their children, the Nisei generation, were born on American soil. They attended American schools, spoke English as their first language, pledged allegiance to the flag each morning, and dreamed American dreams. They played baseball, listened to jazz, and considered themselves thoroughly American despite the fact that their faces told a different story to their neighbors. These young Nisei had parents who farmed California's Central Valley, ran grocery stores in Los Angeles, operated fishing boats in San Pedro. They owned homes, paid taxes, and participated in their communities as much as racism would allow. The Nisei themselves were citizens by birth, protected by the Constitution, or so they believed. They had no meaningful connection to Japan beyond their parents' stories, and perhaps some basic Japanese language skills learned at weekend schools. Japan was the old country, a place most had never seen. America was home, the only home they knew. Then came December 7th, 1941. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing over 2,400 Americans and sinking battleships in the harbor. The attack shocked the nation and brought the United States into World War II. The response was immediate and extended far beyond military mobilization. Within hours, suspicion fell upon anyone of Japanese ancestry living in America. The FBI began midnight raids, arresting community leaders, Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, and businessmen. Families woke to pounding on doors and watched fathers dragged away without charges or explanation. Bank accounts were frozen, businesses were vandalized. Neighbors who had smiled yesterday crossed the street to avoid Japanese-American families today. The hysteria built quickly. Newspapers printed inflammatory cartoons depicting Japanese Americans as saboteurs and spies, despite zero evidence of espionage or sabotage. Military leaders on the West Coast, particularly Lieutenant General John DeWitt, argued that Japanese Americans posed an unacceptable security threat. DeWitt infamously stated that the very absence of sabotage proved that Japanese Americans were waiting for the right moment to strike, a circular logic that made innocence itself evidence of guilt. Pressure mounted on President Franklin Roosevelt to take action. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9266. The document was bureaucratic in its language, but devastating in its impact. It authorized military commanders to designate areas from which any persons could be excluded. Though it didn't explicitly mention Japanese Americans, everyone understood its target. The order effectively suspended constitutional rights for 120,000 people, two-thirds of them American citizens, based solely on their ancestry. There were no charges, no trials, no evidence of wrongdoing required. The justification was military necessity, though decades later, government documents would reveal there was never any legitimate security threat from the Japanese-American community. The forced removal began in spring 1942. Families received notices giving them as little as 48 hours to prepare. They faced an impossible question. What do you take when you can only carry what fits in two hands? Everything else had to be sold immediately or abandoned. Neighbors and opportunists descended like vultures, offering $5 for a car, $20 for a business built over decades. Families sold refrigerators for a fraction of their value, gave away pets, stored precious belongings with churches hoping to reclaim them someday. Some buried family treasures in backyards, hoping their homes would still be theirs when they returned. Most never saw those possessions again. Assembly centers served as the first stop. Families reported to designated locations carrying their suitcases, and wearing identification tags like luggage. At Santa Anita Racetrack in California, families were housed in horse stalls still smelling of manure. They slept on straw mattresses where racehorses had slept weeks before. These were temporary facilities, while the government constructed 10 permanent concentration camps in remote locations. The camps themselves were built in some of the most desolate locations in America: the scorching deserts of California and Arizona, the high desert of Wyoming, the swamps of Arkansas. Manzanar sat in California's Owens Valley, surrounded by mountains and guard towers. Hart Mountain squatted on Wyoming plains, where winter temperatures dropped below zero. Poston and Gila River baked in Arizona heat that exceeded 110 degrees. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, manned by soldiers with rifles pointed inward, not out. The message was clear. These were prisons. Families lived in barracks divided into single rooms measuring 20 by 25 feet. There was no privacy. Walls were thin. Multiple families shared communal bathrooms with no partitions between toilets. Meals were served cafeteria-style in mess halls. The food was institutional and monotonous. Desert dust infiltrated everything despite efforts to seal cracks in the poorly constructed barracks. Summer heat made the tar paper buildings unbearable. Winter cold came through gaps in the floorboards. These American citizens lived behind barbed wire under armed guard, stripped of their homes, their businesses, their dignity, and their constitutional rights. Life in camp was a strange mixture of trying to maintain normalcy under abnormal circumstances. People established schools for children, organized sports leagues, published camp newspapers, and formed community groups. They made gardens in the desert, coaxing flowers from hostile soil. They celebrated holidays and tried to shield children from the full weight of their imprisonment. But the guard towers never disappeared from view. The searchlights swept through the night, the barbed wire remained, and the fundamental injustice poisoned everything. Then in January 1943, the United States government made an announcement that stunned the camps. The military was forming a new combat unit composed entirely of Japanese Americans, the 402nd Regimental Combat Team. They were seeking volunteers. From behind barbed wire, the imprisoned were being asked to fight for the country that had imprisoned them. The request came alongside a loyalty questionnaire that every adult in camp was required to complete. Questions 27 and 28 became infamous for the impossible positions they created. Question 27 asked if the respondent was willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered. Question 28 asked if the respondent would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor. For the Nisei, American citizens imprisoned without cause, the questions were insulting. They were being asked to prove loyalty to a government that had already declared them disloyal without evidence. For their parents, the Nisei generation who were forbidden by law from becoming American citizens, question 28 was a trap. If they forswore allegiance to Japan, they would become stateless people, belonging to no country. Families were torn apart by these questions. Those who answered yes, yes to questions 27 and 28 were separated from those who answered no, no. The no-no respondents were labeled disloyal and sent to the high-security Tule Lake camp. Some answered no out of principle, refusing to pledge loyalty to a government holding them prisoner. Others answered no out of bitterness and despair. Still others answered yes, hoping compliance would prove their loyalty and end the nightmare. The call for military volunteers created another fracture. Young Nisei men faced an impossible moral calculation. The government that had stripped them of everything was now asking them to risk their lives to prove they deserved what should never have been taken. It was an obscene request. Many were furious. They asked why they should fight for a country that considered them enemy aliens, that imprisoned their families, that destroyed their futures. Some refused on principle. But astonishingly, over 33,000 men volunteered from the camps and from Hawaii, where Japanese Americans had not been mass incarcerated. Their motivations were complex and varied. Some believed that military service was the only path to proving their loyalty and securing their families' futures. Some hoped that their sacrifice would earn Japanese Americans the rights that should have been theirs by birth. Some wanted to fight fascism abroad, even while experiencing it at home. Some simply believed in America's ideals even when America failed to live up to them. And some went because they were young men who wanted to serve their country, despite everything. The volunteers left their families behind barbed wire and traveled to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for training. There they faced a different kind of discrimination. Mississippi was deep in Jim Crow territory, and Japanese Americans occupied an uncertain space in the Southern racial hierarchy. They trained alongside the 100th Infantry Battalion, a unit of Japanese Americans from Hawaii who had already seen combat. The Hawaiian Nisei and mainland Nisei initially clashed, the islanders viewing the mainlanders as too passive in the face of discrimination, but they eventually forged unity. They adopted the motto, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling phrase meaning to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. The phrase was perfect for their situation. They were betting their lives that their sacrifice would change America's mind about them. It was the highest stakes gamble imaginable. In June 1944, the 402nd arrived in Italy and entered combat. They landed at Anzio and participated in the Rome-Arno campaign, fighting through the Italian countryside against German forces. The first casualties came quickly. Young men who had left their families in American prison camps bled out on Italian soil. Letters went home to addresses behind barbed wire, telling mothers and fathers that their sons had died fighting for the United States. The surreal cruelty of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. The 402nd fought with a ferocity that shocked observers. They attacked with an intensity that seemed to transcend normal military aggression. Some historians and veterans later reflected that the Nisei soldiers were fighting with something to prove, that their rage at injustice and their determination to validate their families drove them forward when others would have retreated. They took casualties at rates that alarmed commanding officers, but they kept advancing. In October 1944, the 402nd was sent to France and attached to the 36th Infantry Division in the Vosges Mountains. The terrain was brutal. Steep slopes covered in dense forest, cold rain turning to sleet, mud everywhere. The German army had prepared strong defensive positions. On October 24th, the 141st Regiment's 1st Battalion, composed primarily of Texan soldiers, advanced too far and became surrounded. 211 men were trapped deep in the forest, cut off from supply lines and reinforcements. German forces surrounded them on all sides. Artillery and machine gun fire made any approach deadly. For 7 days, the Lost Battalion, as they became known, held out without adequate food, water, or medical supplies. Their casualties mounted. Attempts to rescue them failed. The 402nd received orders to break through and rescue the Lost Battalion. The irony was bitter and obvious. Japanese Americans whose families were imprisoned by their own government were being sent to rescue white Texans, and Texas was a state where Japanese Americans would not have been welcome in many establishments. The 442nd was considered expendable in a way white units were not. The attack began on October 26th. The 402nd advanced through some of the most difficult terrain and determined resistance of the war. German forces were entrenched in positions they had weeks to prepare. Machine gun nests commanded every approach. Artillery rained down constantly. The forest itself became an enemy, with visibility limited to a few yards, and every tree potentially hiding a German soldier. The 442nd advanced meter by bloody meter. For 5 days they fought through hell. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons. Platoons became squads. Soldiers were hit, patched up, and returned to the line. Medics worked under fire. Officers fell and sergeants took command. Sergeants fell and corporals led. The 402nd kept moving forward. They flanked German positions, assaulted fortified points with grenades and bayonets, and pushed through fire that should have stopped them. On October 30th, elements of the 442nd broke through to the Lost Battalion. 211 Texans were saved. The cost was staggering. 216 men of the 442nd were killed. Over 600 were wounded. The mathematics were obscene. They lost more men than they saved. But the rescue succeeded, and the Lost Battalion survivors came face to face with their rescuers. Many of the Texans had never interacted with Japanese Americans before. They saw the faces of the men who had bled to save them. and some understanding passed between them. The 402nd's casualties were so severe that the unit had to be withdrawn and rebuilt. The casualty rate for the regiment over the course of the war would eventually reach 314%, meaning that soldiers were wounded multiple times, recovered, and returned to combat only to be wounded again. Some men were hit 3 or 4 times. They kept going back. In April 1945, the 402nd returned to Italy for the final Allied offensive. The German army had constructed the Gothic Line, a defensive position in the northern Apennine Mountains that had stalled Allied advances for months. The Germans considered it impenetrable. Mountains, mines, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and determined defenders made every meter forward cost Allied lives. Multiple attempts to break through had failed. The 402nd was given the mission to break the Gothic Line. On April 5, 1945, they attacked the mountain positions around Massa and Carrara. Using stealth, speed, and extraordinary courage, they scaled heights the Germans thought impassable, flanked positions thought secure, and assaulted fortifications with devastating effectiveness. In 32 minutes, the 442nd accomplished what other Allied units had failed to do in months. They broke through the Gothic Line. The German defensive position in northern Italy collapsed, and the Allied advance to the Po Valley began. As the German army in Italy disintegrated, elements of the 442nd's Artillery Battalion, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, were detached and attached to other units advancing toward Munich. On April 29, 1945, as they moved through Bavaria, they encountered something none of them were prepared for: satellite camps of the Dachau concentration camp system. The soldiers found survivors, barely alive, behind barbed wire. The parallels were immediate and horrifying. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms. The soldiers saw the camps where Jews and other victims of Nazi genocide had been imprisoned, starved, worked to death, and murdered. They saw the same architecture of imprisonment that held their own families in America. Though Dachau's purpose was extermination, in a way the American camps were not. The soldiers of the 522nd liberated these prisoners. They shared their rations with survivors who weighed 70 pounds. They called for medical help. They bore witness. One Holocaust survivor later recalled that the Japanese-American soldiers cried with them, and that there was understanding between prisoners freed by those whose families were prisoners. The moral complexity of that moment was almost unbearable. Americans imprisoned by America because of their ancestry, liberating Jews imprisoned by Germany because of their ancestry. The 442nd ended the war as the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. They earned 18,143 individual decorations. 9,486 Purple Hearts were awarded for wounds received in combat. They received 21 Medals of Honor, though initially only one was awarded. In 2000, the military reviewed records and upgraded 20 Distinguished Service Crosses to Medals of Honor, correcting a historical injustice that had denied proper recognition to Japanese-American valor. While the 442nd fought in Europe, 6,000 other Nisei served in the Pacific Theater as part of the Military Intelligence Service. Their role was different, but equally vital. These men were linguists, trained at Fort Snelling in Minnesota to use their Japanese language skills for military intelligence. They translated captured documents, interrogated prisoners of war, and intercepted enemy communications. They accompanied combat units from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, island by island across the Pacific. The MIS soldiers faced unique challenges. They looked like the enemy. They had to carry special identification to prevent being shot by their own side. They sometimes wore signs identifying themselves as American soldiers. Despite these precautions, some were nearly killed by friendly fire. Japanese propaganda targeted them specifically, asking over loudspeakers why they fought for America when America imprisoned their families. The propaganda asked what they were dying for. The question haunted many of them, but their contributions were extraordinary. They provided intelligence that prevented ambushes and saved thousands of American lives. They discovered enemy battle plans that allowed American forces to adjust strategies. They intercepted communications that revealed Japanese troop movements and intentions. General Charles Willoughby, chief of intelligence in the Southwest Pacific, later stated that the Nisei linguists shortened the war by 2 years and saved millions of lives. Their work remained classified until the 1970s, so for decades their service was invisible to the public that had imprisoned their families. Throughout the war, soldiers of the 442nd and MIS maintained correspondence with their families in the camps. Every letter was censored, both directions. Soldiers wrote carefully, omitting details about combat and their wounds because they didn't want to worry parents who were already suffering. Parents wrote encouragement from behind barbed wire, trying to maintain morale for sons fighting across oceans. The letters crossed extraordinary gaps between battlefields and prison camps, between freedom and captivity, between those fighting for America and those imprisoned by America. Families in the camps received Western Union telegrams informing them that their sons had been wounded or killed. Military ceremonies were held in the camps when soldiers died. The American flag raised and lowered in a prison camp to honor those who died fighting under that flag. Mothers hung gold stars in barrack windows, the same symbol displayed across America by families who had lost sons in combat. But these gold stars hung in windows surrounded by barbed wire. Some individual stories illustrate the broader experience. Daniel Inouye, who would later serve as a United States Senator from Hawaii for decades, fought with the 442nd in Italy. He lost his right arm to a German grenade in April 1945 while assaulting a machine gun nest. He continued fighting with one arm, leading his platoon forward. His family in Hawaii was not imprisoned, but many of his fellow soldiers had families in camps. Inouye survived and became one of the most powerful politicians in American history, but his sacrifice and that of his generation haunted him for life. Sadao Munemori fought with the 442nd and earned the Medal of Honor posthumously. On April 5, 1945, near Seravezza, Italy, Munemori's squad came under grenade attack. When a grenade landed among his men, Munemori threw himself on it, absorbing the blast with his body and saving his squad. He died instantly. His mother received the Medal of Honor in 1946 at a ceremony. She had been imprisoned at Manzanar. Her son's sacrifice earned the recognition, but it couldn't erase the injustice done to her and her family. Fred Shiosaki of Spokane, Washington fought through France with the 442nd. His parents were imprisoned at Minidoka in Idaho. He was wounded multiple times and kept returning to combat. Decades later, he would speak about the experience, trying to help younger generations understand what it meant to fight for a country that didn't fully accept you. His testimony and that of other veterans became crucial historical records. Every soldier of the 442nd and MIS carried a fundamental question: what am I fighting for? The question had no easy answer. They were fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families without trial. They were fighting for a constitution that was supposed to protect them but had failed. They were fighting for principles that America had betrayed. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. The answer they found, individually and collectively, was complex. They were not fighting for the America that was, but for the America that should be. They were fighting for the principles America claimed to represent, even when America violated those principles. They were fighting to prove that loyalty is not a matter of race or ancestry, but of choice and sacrifice. They were fighting to earn recognition of their humanity and citizenship through blood, because no other currency seemed to be accepted. They were fighting for their families' futures, hoping that their sacrifice would purchase freedom and acceptance. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. Soldiers began returning home. The 442nd held a final parade in Europe, celebrated as heroes, but the MIS soldiers couldn't speak about their service because it remained classified. They came home with no recognition for what they had done. Returning to America was complicated. Some camps remained open into 1946 because families had nowhere to go. Their homes were gone, sold or seized. Their businesses no longer existed. Communities they had lived in for decades no longer wanted them. Signs in shop windows read, "No Japs allowed." Veterans in uniform wearing their decorations were refused service in barber shops and restaurants. The racism that had imprisoned them had not disappeared. Some families attempted to return to their former homes and found new occupants who refused to leave. Legal battles ensued. Some never recovered their property. The financial losses were staggering, estimated at billions of dollars in current value. Families had to start over from nothing, but at least they were no longer behind barbed wire. On July 15, 1946, President Harry Truman received members of the 442nd at the White House. He reviewed them and spoke words that acknowledged what they had accomplished. You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. It was recognition, but it rang hollow for many. They had won battles, but had they won against prejudice? The evidence around them suggested otherwise. Gradually, recognition grew. The heroism of the 442nd and the contributions of the MIS became part of public consciousness. Their service was cited in legal battles against discriminatory laws. Veterans used the GI Bill to obtain education and start businesses, though some schools and lenders still discriminated against them. Some entered politics and law, determined to ensure such injustice never happened again. In 1952, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which finally allowed Japanese immigrants to naturalize as citizens, correcting a racist law that had barred them for decades. The Nisei generation, the parents who had been imprisoned despite living in America for 40 years, could finally become citizens of the country they had always called home. But full recognition of the injustice took much longer. For decades, the incarceration was discussed in euphemistic terms: relocation, internment, evacuation. These words softened the reality of what had happened: imprisonment without trial based on race. Gradually, historians and activists pushed for accurate language and recognition. In 1980, Congress established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to investigate the incarceration. The commission concluded in 1983 that the incarceration was not justified by military necessity, but was the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which officially apologized for the incarceration and authorized reparations payments of $20,000 to each surviving victim. It was inadequate compensation for what had been stolen, but it was acknowledgement. Reagan stated that the nation had made a grave mistake and that what happened must never happen again. In 2000, the military conducted a review of decorations awarded to Asian American veterans, recognizing that racism had prevented proper recognition during and after the war. 20 Distinguished Service Crosses awarded to soldiers of the 442nd were upgraded to Medals of Honor. President Bill Clinton presented the medals at a White House ceremony. By then, many of the soldiers were in their 80s or had already died. Their families received the medals posthumously. In 2010, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 482nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service, recognizing their service and sacrifice. The ceremony included surviving veterans, now in their 90s, and family members of those who had died. It was honor 6 decades overdue. What did the Nisei soldiers prove? They proved that loyalty is not racial, not inherited, not written in blood or carried in genes. Loyalty is chosen. It is demonstrated through action. They proved that American identity is not defined by appearance or ancestry, but by commitment to principles. They proved that courage under fire can challenge prejudice, though not erase it. But they also revealed an ultimate paradox at the heart of their experience. They were prisoners fighting for freedom. They were second-class citizens who became first-class heroes. They were the betrayed defending their betrayers. This paradox raises questions that America still struggles to answer. What does it mean when you must earn rights you are born with? The Constitution guaranteed birthright citizenship and due process, yet these were stripped away without trial. The Nisei soldiers had to purchase with blood what should have been theirs by birth. Why did they have to prove their humanity and loyalty when white Americans did not? How much must a people sacrifice to be seen as human? The 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate. They lost more men rescuing others than were rescued. They earned more decorations than any comparable unit. Was this enough? For some Americans it was. For others, No amount of sacrifice would overcome racial prejudice. The burden placed on Japanese Americans was one that no other group had to carry. Can a nation imprison its own citizens and claim to stand for freedom? The United States was fighting fascism abroad while practicing it at home. The contradiction was noted by America's enemies and by thoughtful observers worldwide. Japanese propaganda used the incarceration to argue that American democracy was hypocritical. They were not entirely wrong. The Nisei soldiers' answer to history was not given in words, but in action. They didn't fight for the America that existed in 1943, the America that imprisoned their families and stripped them of rights. They fought for an America that didn't yet exist, an America that lived up to its founding principles, an America where all citizens were truly equal regardless of race. They fought for the America that should be, betting their lives that their sacrifice would help create it. Their blood purchased moral authority that words never could have. When they returned home wearing their uniforms and displaying their wounds and medals, they forced America to confront its own racism. How could the nation deny full citizenship and equality to men who had sacrificed so much? How could white Americans maintain prejudice against soldiers who had saved white soldiers' lives? The contradiction became harder to maintain, though it didn't disappear overnight. The relevance of their story extends beyond history. Today, when debates about loyalty, identity, and belonging resurface, when fear drives calls to restrict rights based on religion or national origin, when appearance determines who is questioned about their allegiance, the story of the Nisei soldiers provides crucial lessons. They prove that judging people by their ancestry or appearance, rather than their actions, leads to profound injustice. The danger of fear-driven policy is evident in their story. After Pearl Harbor, fear and wartime hysteria led to the suspension of constitutional rights for 120,000 people. No evidence supported the security justification. No Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage related to World War II. The incarceration was driven by racism disguised as security concerns. When fear dominates policymaking, injustice follows. The cost of demanding that certain groups prove their loyalty, while others' loyalty is assumed, is a burden that distorts citizenship. White Americans were not asked to prove their loyalty, despite the fact that German Americans and Italian Americans had ancestral connections to enemy nations. Only Japanese Americans faced mass incarceration. This double standard revealed the racial basis of the policy. Courage means proving loyalty to those who doubt you, but the Nisei soldiers demonstrated that such proof comes at extraordinary cost. They gave everything, and some still faced discrimination when they returned. Their courage shamed America into gradual recognition, but recognition came slowly and incompletely. The motto, "Go for broke," carried weight beyond its gambling origins. The Nisei soldiers risked everything, their lives, their bodies, their souls. They gambled that their sacrifice would change how America saw them and their families. They wagered blood against prejudice. In many ways, they won. The camps closed. Discriminatory laws eventually changed. Japanese Americans gained fuller acceptance in American society. Veterans became respected community leaders, business owners, educators, and politicians. But the cost was staggering. Over 800 men of the 442nd and MIS died in combat. Thousands more carried physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. Families spent years behind barbed wire, losing homes and businesses, and decades of accumulated wealth. The price of proving belonging was measured in destroyed lives and sacrificed futures. They won their families' freedom with their blood. As the war ended and the camps began to close, the connection between military service and release was clear. The heroism of the 442nd made the continued incarceration of their families politically untenable. Their sacrifice purchased freedom, but freedom should never have required purchase. They forced America to see itself clearly. By fighting brilliantly for a nation that imprisoned them, they held up a mirror to American hypocrisy. The reflection was uncomfortable. America claimed to fight for freedom and democracy while denying both to its own citizens. The Nisei soldiers made that contradiction impossible to ignore. The 442nd and MIS didn't just win battles, they won the moral argument. No one could credibly claim Japanese Americans were disloyal after such service and sacrifice. The racist justifications for incarceration collapsed under the weight of their heroism. It took time for recognition to follow, but the moral victory was clear. Their legacy is the most expensive proof of belonging in American history. No other group had to sacrifice so much to be recognized as American. No other citizens had to earn at such cost what should have been theirs by right. The price was paid in blood and treasure and years of lost freedom. The final reflection is perhaps the most important. They should never have had to prove it at all. The incarceration was wrong. The demand that they prove loyalty through military service was wrong. The burden placed on them was unjust. They met that burden with extraordinary courage and sacrifice, but the burden should never have existed. Every American should enjoy the rights and protections of citizenship without having to prove their humanity through sacrifice. That the Nisei soldiers had to do so represents a profound failure of American democracy, even as their response to that failure represents democracy's highest ideals. Their story is simultaneously a celebration of human courage and an indictment of institutionalized racism, a testament to what people can overcome and a reminder of injustices that should never be repeated.